Every person who ever met Jim Jones described the same thing first. Before they described the theology, before they described the organization, before they described what he built and what he destroyed, they described the eyes. Not the dark glasses, though the glasses came later and became the image most associated with him. The eyes behind them. The quality of attention they carried. The feeling, reported by politicians and congregants and journalists and inner circle members and people who met him once at a reception and people who spent 20 years inside his organization, the universal, consistent, across every account feeling that when Jim Jones looked at you, he already knew something about you that you had not told him. Something true. Something you might not have told anyone. Something that, in the moment of being seen, felt less like an invasion than like a relief. Like being found. The people who later came to understand what Jones was, who survived Jonestown or watched from the outside as it built toward catastrophe, describe this quality with a uniformity that is itself remarkable. They do not say he was perceptive. They do not say he was intuitive. They say he saw them, in a way that no one else had seen them, in a way that, once experienced, was very hard to leave. This is the quality that survived everything else. The medications degraded his cognition. The isolation degraded his judgment. The paranoid disorder distorted his perception of threat until the threat was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The performance consumed the performer. By the final years in Jonestown, almost everything that had made Jim Jones what he was had been altered or damaged or pharmaceutically managed into something that only resembled its original form. Almost everything. The one thing that remained, that the survivors and the inner circle members and the researchers who have spent years with the recordings all confirm was present until the very end, was this: the ability to read a person. To find, within seconds of encountering them, the specific thing they needed, the wound they were carrying, the question they had stopped asking because they had given up on an answer, the part of themselves they had hidden so thoroughly that they had nearly forgotten it was there. Jones found it, every time, until the end. And the question of where that ability came from, how it was built, what it cost, and how it finally consumed the man who carried it is the question this video is about. If you have ever felt truly seen by someone and wondered afterward what that feeling actually was, subscribe right now and hit the bell, because that question is at the center of everything Jim Jones built, and understanding the answer is the only protection against it. Go back to the beginning. Go back to Lincoln, Indiana, in the late 1930s, where James Warren Jones is 6 or 7 years old and already doing something that the adults around him cannot fully explain. His neighbors remember him organizing the other children in the neighborhood into a congregation. Not playing church the way children play at adult activities, imitating without understanding. Actually preaching. Standing in front of the other children with a quality of authority that they found, even then, difficult to walk away from. A neighbor who was one of those children, speaking to a researcher decades later, said, he would look at you and say something and you would think, how did he know that? Not about God, about you. He would say something about what you were worried about or what you wanted or what you were afraid of, and it would be right. And you were 7 years old, and you didn't know how to evaluate that, so you just felt it. You just felt found. The ability was not supernatural. It was not mystical. It was, in the assessment of the researchers and psychologists who have studied Jones most carefully, a form of what the psychological literature calls hypervigilant social cognition, a pattern of attention to other people's emotional states that develops, in certain individuals, as a response to early environments where reading the room accurately was essential to safety. Jones's childhood was unstable in ways that are documented across multiple biographies. His father was largely absent and when present was volatile. His mother was extraordinary but also erratic, loving and fierce and unconventional in ways that created, for the child, an environment where the emotional weather could change without warning and where survival required knowing, at every moment, what the adults around you were feeling and what they needed. Children who grow up in those environments learn to read emotional states with a precision that people raised in more stable circumstances never develop. They learn to notice the micro-expressions, the slight changes in posture, the particular quality of silence before something happens. They learn to find, in the behavior of the people around them, the information they need before the information becomes a crisis. Jones learned this. He learned it so completely and so early that it became, by the time he was an adult, as automatic and as invisible to him as breathing. He did not choose to read people. He simply did. He had always done it. He did not know how to stop. What Jones understood, what his hypervigilant social cognition gave him that most people do not have, is that every human being is carrying something they have not been able to put down. A grief, an inadequacy, a question that has gone unanswered for so long that the person has stopped consciously asking it, but that shapes everything they do, every room they enter, every person they trust or do not trust. Jones could find that thing. He could find it in the way a person held their shoulders, in the cadence of how they spoke, in what they laughed at and what they did not laugh at, in the particular quality of attention they brought to specific words in a sermon. He could find it in 30 seconds, and once he found it, he knew what to say. Not what the person wanted to hear, that is a different and lesser skill. What the person needed to hear. The thing that, when said, produced in the listener the sensation of being understood in a way they had never been understood, of having the wound acknowledged by someone who had, somehow, known it was there. This is what the political figures who endorsed Jones felt. This is what the congregants who gave everything they had felt. This is what the journalists who wrote favorable profiles felt, and what the inner circle members who stayed long past the point where staying was rational felt, and what the people who spent 20 years inside People's Temple felt. Not manipulation, or not only manipulation. Something that felt, in the moment of experiencing it, like the real thing, like genuine understanding, like being seen by someone who, in a world that mostly looked past you, had stopped and looked directly at you and found you. And the terrible, durable truth about that feeling, the truth that explains more about Jonestown than any other single fact, is that it was not entirely false. Jones's perception of the people he encountered was accurate. The wound he identified was real. The need he named was the actual need. He was not inventing what he saw. He was seeing it. The manipulation was not in the seeing. The manipulation was in what he did with what he saw. Because what Jones did with what he saw, with the wound, the need, the hidden question, was not address it, was not heal it, was not provide whatever the person actually required to move through it. What he did was use it. He used it to create a dependency that felt like belonging. He gave the person the experience of being seen, which is one of the most powerful experiences available to a human being. And then he made that experience available only through him and only on his terms. He became the answer to the question, the only answer. The person who saw you when no one else saw you. The person whose attention, once given, you could not afford to lose. And losing it, being wrong, questioning, considering leaving, meant returning to the invisibility you had lived in before Jones found you. Meant putting back down the sense of being known that you had not had before him. Most people, once they had felt that, could not put it back down. Jones knew they could not. He had known, from the first time he used the ability as a child organizing the neighborhood children, that being seen is the thing people cannot walk away from. He had built his entire life on that knowledge. He had built Jonestown on it. The degradation of the ability in the final years is one of the most documented and least discussed aspects of the Jonestown account. Survivors who were there from the early years and through to the end describe a specific change that occurred sometime in the mid-1970s, a point at which Jones's ability to read individuals began to be replaced by something cruder and more frightening. The precision went first. The ability to find the specific wound in a specific person, to say the true thing in the 30 seconds of looking, gave way to a more general and more aggressive version, Jones identifying fear in groups rather than need in individuals, responding to the emotional temperature of a crowd rather than the interior of a person. The inner circle members who observed this change most closely describe it with a consistency that suggests they were all watching the same thing. They say he stopped looking at people. He looked through them, or past them, or at something only he could see. The eyes that had made everyone feel found now made people feel, according to the accounts, unseen in a new and more disturbing way, not overlooked but looked through, as if the person in front of him had become transparent, a member of a category rather than an individual with a specific interior. The psychiatrist who studied the survivors wrote about this change in terms that connected directly to the pharmaceutical and neurological deterioration documented in the autopsy toxicology report. She wrote that the hypervigilant social cognition that had been Jones's primary tool throughout his career requires, like all complex cognitive functions, adequate sleep, adequate neurological stability, and the absence of the kind of chronic pharmaceutical disruption documented in his final years. She wrote that what the survivors were describing, the shift from precise individual reading to crude group effect management, was consistent with the cognitive changes produced by long-term stimulant use combined with the psychiatric medications in his regimen. She wrote, the tool was built on a foundation that the medications eroded. By the end, he was using the memory of the tool rather than the tool itself. He remembered how it had felt to find the wound in a person. He remembered the response it produced. He tried to reproduce the response without the perception that had originally generated it. And the congregation, which had been trained over years to respond to Jones as the person who saw them, responded. Not because he was seeing them, because they had learned to respond to the cue. The performance of seeing without the seeing. The last thing to go. But it went too. There is one account that appears in the survivor testimony that no researcher has been able to corroborate or disprove, and that Stephen Jones, when asked about it, said he did not know whether it was true but that it did not surprise him. A woman who was in Jonestown in the final months said that on one of the last nights before the massacre, she was walking past Jones's residence late at night and heard him speaking. Not through the speakers, through the window, in a voice too quiet for the speakers. She stopped. She said he was speaking to someone, but when she looked through the window, there was no one else in the room. She said he was describing a person in detail, with the precision that she had heard him use in the early years when he identified someone's wound in a sermon and named it and watched the person's face change. He was describing someone in that same language. The specific hurt, the specific need, the specific question the person had stopped asking, but there was no one there. She said she stood outside the window for several minutes listening. She said it was the most frightening thing she heard in Jonestown, including everything that came after, because what she was hearing was the ability without an object, the seeing without anyone to see, the tool, operating in the dark, on its own, after everything else had gone. She said, he was still looking, he had always been looking. Even then, even at the end, even alone in the dark with no one in front of him, he was still trying to find the wound, still trying to see. It was the only thing he had ever known how to do, and there was no one left to do it for. We do not know if that account is accurate. We know that the ability was real. We know it was the foundation on which everything else was built. We know it outlasted the theology and the politics and the charisma and the pharmaceutical management and the paranoid distortion and almost everything else that Jones was. We know that it cost him something to carry it. That a person who spends their life finding other people's wounds is a person who has never been far from wounds, who learned to see them because they had to, who built a movement out of the knowledge that every human being is carrying something they cannot put down and that the person who can name that thing holds a power that most people will not resist. Jones named it for 30 years. He named it for 918 people who could not afford to put it back down after he named it. He named it in a room in Indianapolis and a church in California and a jungle in Guyana and, if the account is true, alone at night at the end, in a room with no one, still looking, still finding, still trying to see the thing that had made him what he was from the beginning and that had never, not once, been turned on himself. The one wound he could find in everyone and never in the man whose eyes were doing the finding. The researchers who have spent the most time with the Jonestown material, the recordings, the survivor testimony, the documents, the autopsy reports, describe a shared experience that they mention only when pressed, usually at the end of interviews, usually with a kind of embarrassment that professional detachment is supposed to prevent. They describe the feeling, when they listen to the early recordings of Jones preaching, of being spoken to directly, not of being manipulated. They know, intellectually, what Jones was doing and how he was doing it, of being spoken to, of the voice finding something in them that they had not expected to be found. Several of them have described stopping the recording and sitting with the feeling for a moment before continuing. One researcher, who had spent 7 years on the project and who described herself as the least credulous person she knew, said, I would listen to the early sermons and I would feel him looking at me through the recording, looking for the thing I was carrying. And the terrible part, the part one have never been able to fully explain, is that I knew it was impossible. I knew he was dead. I knew it was a recording. I knew everything I knew about how the ability worked and what it had produced. And I still felt it. I still felt found. That is what the ability was. That is what it did. That is why 918 people followed him to Guyana. Not because they were naive or stupid or broken, though some were all of those things. Because being found, once you have experienced it, is very hard to unfeel. And Jim Jones, whatever else he was the most precise finder most of them had ever encountered. He found them once, he held what he found, and he never let go. That is the whole story. The people who escaped Jonestown describe the aftermath in terms that converge on a single experience. They describe the feeling of being unseen again, of returning to a world that looked past them, that did not know what Jones had known, that could not find the wound because it had not spent 30 years developing the ability to find wounds. They describe this not as relief but as a specific and difficult kind of loss. The loss of being known, even by someone who had used that knowledge against them. They describe missing the eyes. Not Jones, the eyes, the quality of attention, the feeling of being found. Several of them sought it afterward in other leaders, other communities. Several of them, in finding it again, understood for the first time what it had been, not a supernatural gift, but a skill, a human skill, built on a human wound, used for human purposes that ranged from genuine care to catastrophic destruction. A skill that exists in the world, in people who have it to varying degrees, and that will always find the people who most need to be found, because those people are everywhere, because we are all carrying something we have not been able to put down, and we are all, in some part of ourselves that we do not always acknowledge, waiting for the person who can see it. Jim Jones knew it. He built a world on it. And the world it built is the reason we are still asking, 40 years later, how it was possible. That is what Jim Jones understood. That is what he used. That is what survived when almost everything else about him was gone. And that is the question his life leaves behind, not whether the ability was real, because it was, but whether it was possible to have it and use it honestly. Whether the person who can find the wound can also resist the power that finding it produces. Whether seeing truly and using what you see for something other than control is a thing that the ability allows, or whether the ability itself, the hypervigilance social cognition, built on a childhood of managed threat, refined over decades into something that looked like grace, carries inside it, from the very beginning, the logic of what Jones became. Whether the finder was always going to be found, in the end, by the thing he spent his life finding in others. The wound. His wound. The one he could find in everyone and never in himself. The one that built Jonestown. The one that was there at the beginning, in a yard in Indiana, when a boy looked at the other children and found, in 30 seconds, what they were carrying, and understood, for the first time, and for every moment that followed, that he had something they needed, and did not yet know, and perhaps never fully knew, what it would cost to keep giving it.